What's up, everybody? This is your man Ant Walker, joined by Pat Auger here for the Body Lock. It's been a little while since we did one of these, but we had a few topics that we thought were worth addressing. So we decided to brush the dirt off our shoulders, turn the mics on, and get to talking. Pat, let's go ahead and jump right into it, so we can get this train rolling. Now, Saturday night we had a rather interesting event from the Apex Center in Las Vegas. The card was headlined by Derek Brunson and Edmund Shabazian, but of course, that card looked almost nothing like its original iteration for a variety of reasons. Now, I've discussed this topic very recently, and I'm sure you have as well. I'm not sure if you've done that on camera or whatnot, but I think this is something worth discussing. Again, like, was this like the most cursed card you could ever remember? What was the experience like for you watching?
Yeah, I mean this card in itself, just looking back before the card even started, right? Like, because originally it wasn't even supposed to be Shabazian and Brunson. It was supposed to be Holm versus Aldana. This card had, at the end of the day, had 12 canceled or fizzled fights on it. I don't think I've ever seen that happen. You could have built an entire new card with all the fights that got canceled originally, and then it looked like, leading up to it, looked like everything was going smoothly and you at least had some semblance of a regular card. Then you had, Friday, it comes up that, and really Saturday before the event, but I guess on Friday, Gerald Mearshart ended up testing positive for COVID. And then they did a follow-up test on Saturday morning to make sure it wasn't a false positive, and it was positive again. So they sent him home, even though he had been there and had tested negative on Tuesday. So we know there are protocols in place to keep fighters from interacting, but we've also seen evidence that, some fighters are mingling a little bit and doing that type of thing. So it's interesting to see that happen, to see a fight get pulled day of because of COVID. And then, you also had Trevin Giles, who fainted before his fight. And so you had Trevin Giles versus Kevin Holland be pulled from the commission. I think that was the right call overall. But I mean, this card was a shell of itself. It just was a complete disaster, which is saying something given how all the cards up until then had been pretty well put on. Abu Dhabi ran very smoothly. Even before Abu Dhabi, things seemed to go all right. It's really just their first, the first card where things fell apart. But this shows shows what can happen in the fight business. It's not as devastating as, say, Nurmagomedov versus Ferguson versus Holloway versus Ally Quinta eventually. I don't think it hits as hard as that for me, but it was interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, you know what? I remember some tweets. I want to say Nolan King of MMA Junkie, as this was starting to unfold and a lot of these fights were falling off within the span of, say, like 36 hours or something like that. The turnover that this card was experiencing, in particular, I think Jamal Emmers, his original fight was thrown off, and he fought Vince Cachero instead.
Yeah.
And I remember that, like, at that point, he tweeted something about how this was the craziest span of time he could ever remember, covering the sport. And my immediate thought was UFC 223 and the insanity of that, the few hours surrounding that weigh-in, to have Conor McGregor in court, to have Max Holloway deemed medically unfit, to then have potentially Anthony Pettis step in, that gets nicked. So then Paul Felder, that gets nicked. So then it turns into Ally Quinta, like just how the insanity that happened right there. And then we could think about a few other cards where there were so many fights that dropped off, and the what the final product looked nothing like the original. This one took a different turn for me. And not to make light of any of the real issues that caused this, because obviously COVID-19 is no joke. Having Trevin Giles pass out just seconds before he's supposed to begin his walk is horribly scary, and something that nobody wants to see repeat itself in the sport. But I mean, from a broadcasting standpoint, I actually thought it made things more entertaining, because we were witnessing a train wreck in operation. It is, the wheels are falling off as we're watching. It was like driving past a car accident and everyone rubbernecking. Is sort of the feel like I got with it, to where you just had to throw your hands and say whatever. When you have 12 canceled or fizzled bouts as listed on Tapology, and then only 8 fights were on the card. It says a lot. It says a lot. I mean, it was so interesting seeing the broadcasters trying to scramble to fill in airtime, and how many times can we run this promo package? How many times can we cut to the desk? How many times can we do something other than show fights, because there aren't any other fights to show? It's just an absolute kind of a disastrous circus is what it came off like. I mean, I'll say this: I think they were better off that it happened on a fight night as opposed to a pay-per-view, especially if it was one of the Fight Island pay-per-views, and knowing the hoops and ladders that had to be conquered in order to get to that point. It's good that it just happened at the Apex Center in a more controlled environment. That in a fight card that would have flown under the radar anyway, and we'll probably forget about by this time next week. So I'll take that, But as far as some of the more serious things that happen on there, beyond the Trevin Giles thing, because I think it's dangerous to talk in speculation about
right
what happened, and we have no idea what his test results look like, unless I missed a report, which I don't think I have. I've been looking. Unless we missed some sort of information that's been released, we don't know what's going on there. So I don't want to speculate. I will say this though, and I've said this on other platforms, and I think it's important to say it again. The idea that, I mean, I find it so irresponsible that on the broadcast they were speculating that he passed out due to fear or nerves or something, and that's so disrespectful to a man who cage fights for a living, in addition to being a Houston police officer. Obviously, one of the most stressful, dangerous jobs that someone can have. Yet he passes out before he's doing something far safer than his actual, full-time job, and this part-time job he's done quite a few times, and he's kind of used to this thing. Just thought that was a little irresponsible on the broadcasting team. So let's get that out there. But I think the other more serious thing that we can talk about, besides COVID-19, besides the health scares, including Joanne Calderwood passed out after her upset loss to Jennifer Maia. We've had some really, really bad news reported as far as fighter pay. And I know we come back to this topic on a regular basis, but we do it because it is a severe problem in the sport. Ed Herman not paid his full show money when his opponent, Gerald Mershart, came down with COVID-19. Due to no fault of his own. I'm not sure what anything was done for Kevin Holland. I don't know. He's been rebooked for this upcoming week. So that situation is, I guess, kind of resolved itself in a way. But still, I'm quite troubled at the notion that the UFC can have money set aside to pay fighters to show up and fight, and due to no fault of their own. In fact, in part due to irresponsible behavior on the UFC's part, as far as their level of contact tracing, as far as the level of testing. I don't know, they've done a spectacular job with a lot of things, but the onus is on them to get this right. How can you rightfully punish the athletes who show up healthy to do the job that they've been contracted to do?
Yeah, no, it's from what I read too, the reports are that he was offered around 10 grand. Ed Herman was, or so. And normally his I believe his show and win is around 54, and was probably going to be higher because he had won recently and I think renegotiated a contract. So, it's really tough because from a fighter standpoint, right, you're taking extra risk right now taking a fight. No, like there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If you weren't taking extra risk, the UFC wouldn't be putting on the protocols that they're putting on. That by them basically putting in the testing, trying to lock things down, and all of that, that in itself shows that that's proof that they're taking on extra hazard than normal in order to fight. And, Dana White has said that if you don't want to fight, you don't have to, and that's a fighter's choice. That's perfectly fine. But for you to take on that extra risk, get there, have your opponent test positive, and then there's no backup opponent for you, and you get offered a fraction of, we're talking less than 20% of your show purse to show up after you've put in a full camp, you've done all this stuff. That's heartbreaking. And it's something, again, that, as you mentioned, we keep coming back to this topic, but it's still relevant, and things like this keep happening. And this kind of shows the UFC's power. And it's one of those things from a business standpoint, they have no incentive. They have no incentive whatsoever, especially for a fighter like Ed Herman, who's probably not going to make a run at a title. He's older. He's been around for a while. He's a little bit of a name, but he's not, he's not a staple that was a former champion or a former, number one contender in their, organization. They have no incentive to give him that full amount of money because they have the outs and they have the precautions that say, hey, you're an independent contractor. We don't have to do that. And they're probably worried on their end about that precedent, right? Now, if they set a precedent of like, okay, we're going to pay you, Ed, because you came out here and did this. Now imagine we get to next weekend and Stipe and Daniel Cormier are fighting, and Stipe, let's go with the option that Daniel Cormier pulls out. He gets test positive for COVID, he gets pulled out. Well, now you've already set a precedent that you're going to pay fighters their show money. Paying a champion show money when there's no fight going on, that's a little bit more of a hit to their bottom line. And we could go on and talk about how, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that much of a hit to their bottom line. But that's just essentially, they're probably part of their mindset is, hey, we're not going to set the precedent that we're going to give you full show money when this happens, because my guess is, as this goes on, especially with the way the cases have been handled in the US, because the UFC is not doing as strict a protocol as they did in Abu Dhabi, my guess is they're expecting more and more fighters for this circumstance to happen. If you look at the past several cards, right, where they've been able to find replacement fighters, a lot of those fighters are like local regional guys that are basically like, oh, I get a shot at the UFC now, like I'm taking that fight. And they've been able to find enough of those guys. But in the, again, in the grand scheme of it all, you're looking at, what happens when these tests keep coming up or people keep pulling out for whatever reason, maybe COVID related, but maybe not due to pandemic issues or travel issues, especially for foreign fighters. And, they don't want to pay everybody their show money, because then that becomes a burden that adds up. So I think it's partially the UFC not wanting to set a precedent. I think, again, it's them taking advantage of the fact that technically fighters are listed as independent contractors, and they are going to want to show that, especially with the court case that's going on right now. They don't want to give any inclination that fighters are employees, because that has not been resolved. The judge hasn't made a decision on that class action lawsuit. Anything they do right now could hypothetically make its way to the judge's desk, and he could see that and say, oh, and possibly, if this continues on further, right now they're just doing class action, but if this gets to a trial, anything they do is going to end up being able to be used against them. So it's not surprising. It's sad. It is what it is type of situation. And until a union or until some legislation gets passed that really starts to protect fighters' rights and give them, more options, or unless they're able to amend contracts to say like, hey, I'm getting show money if a fighter pulls out and it's no fault of my own, UFC is not going to do it. They don't have the incentive to, and that's really that's the heart of the problem. There's no incentive for the UFC to lose that money, because, and the UFC has once again proved time and time and again, that's their main driver, is they are all about profits. They never want to take a loss in any sort of financial way, even if it's a small one like Ed Herman's show money, which they could have easily paid. That's not they're always thinking about what's the risk reward here. And to them, it was just a pure loss.
I'm glad you brought up the idea of a contract, saying, making it very clear what happens in case an opponent pulls out. and you are left without a fight after you do everything you're supposed to do. Where are the managers of these fighters? Please explain to me why MMA managers who somehow or another have become celebrities in the fight world in their own ways are not negotiating these things for their fighters. Why is this seems like the most basic of protecting your client, to make sure that they get paid something, probably what they were supposed to get paid for showing up and doing exactly what they were supposed to do, until the other half was unable to fulfill their obligation for whatever reason. It doesn't seem like this is advanced legal work here. I mean, you're definitely more in tune with the business and legal side than I am. Does that seem like a ridiculous clause to have in a contract?
It's not a ridiculous clause in terms of, practicality, but if you look back at some of the emails that have been released regarding Joe Silva's testimony, specifically when he was matchmaker during his tenure in the UFC, and of course there was the hashtag Joe Silva stories that we've talked about on here. When you look at some of those emails that came out in the court case, you could see how much power Joe Silva had, in terms of, you had managers basically, in some cases, basically saying like, hey, he's got a family, or hey, like he's a really good dude, like basically semi-begging their like Silva to give them a higher pay rate or give them something. And the issue is the UFC still has all that power. So if I'm a manager and I go to the UFC and I say, all right, I need this in my client's contract that says, no matter what, if somebody pulls out last minute, I'm getting at least my show money. If you do that and they don't kind of owe you a favor for stepping in late notice, or saying, I'll do this type of marketing, or I'll do this spot for you guys, or whatever, from that standpoint, there's nothing that stops the UFC from saying no. Like, go to Bellator, go to PFL. We have plenty of fighters. We don't have to do that. Or they could say, if you're a big enough name or you're an up and coming name, they could say, sure. And then they could purposefully matchmake you in horrible situations and try and give you short notice fights that, or stylistic matchups that are a nightmare for you. And that becomes an issue where, for the manager, they don't really have a lot of power. That was something that was demonstrated clearly by the way that fighter pay in the lawsuit was revealed was very formulaic. In most cases, there was a set formula of, you had this many fights and then you moved up to a set tier, and across the board, regardless of who your manager was, most fighters followed that formula. In the rare instance that they saw drawing power metrics, or they saw that, social media presence, or you started to become a star, or maybe you were associated with a bigger name like Shabazian was with Ronda Rousey, so you can kind of leverage that a little bit. In those cases, then they started to make the exceptions. But in general, they don't make exceptions unless you're willing to play ball with them for short notice fights or different media obligations or what have you. I think the best example of what we can see post Joe Silva is the way that James Krause has renegotiated his contracts and been very vocal about, I play ball with them. If they need me for something, I'm there. I'll do it, whatever. And in return, I'll take this 2-day short notice fight against somebody that may knock me out from finally breaking into the rankings, but you need a body filled here. But in return, you're going to, give me a little bit more pay, or you're going to give me a concession here or there. That's the best option a fighter has in this current environment. And really, it has nothing to do with what the manager can provide in most cases. So, managers could unite and really take a stand. I know some of them, especially with the clients that have been more vocal about their displeasure, like John Jones, and some of the bigger name clients, and their managers have kind of come out. Masvidal, if you look at Kawa, that's a great example of a manager who's kind of started to come out a little bit against some of the practices. But even then, unless they all kind of get together and agree, like, hey, we got to do what's best for our clients, as long as one or two of them plays ball and gets special treatment on his end, what are you going to do? So it's a rock and a hard place for a lot of managers, where I can go in there and say, I need that clause in the contract. but there's nothing. UFC will have all the leverage, and they'll have no incentive to give it to me, even if I do advocate for my client, like, hey, I need to do that. And if I do, they might not give it to me, and then may hurt my client because I even asked, and that becomes a whole part of the issue.
Well, certainly a damning prognosis for fighter issues there. I mean, quite frankly, only litigation is going to resolve some of these issues. So it is what it is in the meantime.